Hello YouTube, thank you for joining me. It's been a while since I've done an anime ramble, though to be fair, this shouldn't really qualify as a ramble. By the time this is done, I hope for it to come across as a somewhat organized discussion. I've now been acquainted with Digimon for about 12 years. That's given me plenty of time to linger on certain topics and analyze them to death. One of these topics, something I mentioned in passing in my review for the second season, is whether or not Davis was really the one who should have been leading the Digidestined. I revisited this question recently and thought I'd share my take on it. Let's start with his predecessor, because Davis had a lot to live up to. Adventure's greatest strength was its characters, and Tai was definitely one of the ones who grew the most over the course of the season. I'm not saying it wasn't clear from the beginning who the leader was going to be. Tai was always the one pushing the other kids forward and jumping into battle, but he wasn't automatically accepted as their leader, not by the other kids anyway. In the beginning, factoring his team's well-being into his plans was not one of Tai's strengths, and it was for this reason that Matt was always challenging his authority. But Tai grows up a lot over the course of Adventure. He learns to work with the other Digidestined, as opposed to kind of just forcing them to do what he thinks is best. In fact, the almost final battle with Piedmon is one of my favorite parts of the first season. Watching Tai direct that battle really shows how far he's come. He understands his team's strengths and weaknesses, and he's learned a thing or two about strategizing. By the end of Adventure, the Digidestined had a competent leader. And then we hit Season 2. I've tried to approach this with as little bias as possible, and after analyzing him a little more, I don't hate Davis. I still don't like him that much either, but I can understand where the writers were going with his character. I don't feel like he ever quite lives up to Tai. Tai could be hot-headed and stubborn, but he wasn't outright dumb. A lot of the time it felt like Davis existed to be a comic relief character, which was fine, until you took a step back and realized, oh wait, this kid's supposed to be our leader. Don't get me wrong, Davis wasn't totally hopeless. The other Digidestined could always depend on him. He didn't hold grudges, and if there was one thing Davis really excelled at, it was keeping team morale high. All of these are really important qualities, but they don't really make up for the rest of it. I don't think Davis really understood his own responsibility. In fact, I think it's very possible Davis didn't actually see himself as their leader, just another part of a team where everyone was equally important. This at least would explain why I feel he never really stepped up and tried to better understand his team. With one exception. And to be honest, it's not just Davis. The 02 team as a whole seemed a lot less close than the Adventure one. But I think that has more to do with the setup of Season 2 than anything else. Because they're not totally stranded in the digital world, their survival doesn't depend on their ability to get along and work together quite as much. But I digress. Anyway, Davis's tendency to always be the first to fearlessly charge into battle, I feel, has more to do with just who he is, not because he thinks his team is depending on him to lead them. Had Davis been aware of his own importance, I'm sure he would have stepped up to the challenge, but as I've stated, I don't think he was. As it is, Davis doesn't really grow or mature at all over the course of 02. So what really brought this on was that, logically speaking, it just didn't make sense to me that the other kids would accept Davis as their leader so easily. It would make more sense if it wasn't for two other members of this team. TK and Kari have both been defending the digital world since they were little kids. They have so much more experience, and either one of them on their own is more team-oriented than Davis. On top of that, the crests of Hope and Light have always been a bit stronger than the others. I could definitely see a second season being used to groom one of them into a strong team leader, but that's not to say they don't both have their flaws too. Funnily enough, one of the main reasons I didn't take to Davis right away actually does Kari a lot of justice. Davis's crush on Kari is amusing at best, irritating at worst. A lot of the time it felt like Davis didn't necessarily have a crush on Kari. He had this cartoonish romantic fantasy that he foisted onto the first nice, pretty girl who caught his eye, who just happened to be Kari. What he really wanted was to be admired for acting cool and heroic, which I find fitting given that they're like 12. Anyway, trying to fulfill this particular dream means Davis frequently tries to turn Kari into his damsel in distress, and quite a bit of the time Kari is the one who needs to be rescued or protected from something, but especially in the earlier episodes, the idea that Davis was going to be her knight in shining armor was laughable. Kari was far more capable of taking care of herself than he was. And that might just come from familiarity with the world early on, but Kari does do her part whenever things get rough, and as I've mentioned, power-wise, Kari has a bit of an advantage from the start. Gatomon is the only partner to retain champion level as her default form, and the Crest of Light practically turns Kari into a digi-goddess on more than one occasion. However, I don't think Kari has the confidence to be a true leader. A lot of the qualities that make her pure, and thus the rightful wielder of such a powerful crest, are the same qualities that would hold her back in this regard. Kari has always struck me as the type who can go along with someone else's plan if the team agrees it's best, but not the type who can make the hard decisions herself. And while it's great that she wants to keep the fighting and violence to a minimum, you can't really afford to doubt yourself when the well-being of the world is at stake. Which brings us to TK. Originally, I thought he was the obvious choice for leader, but everyone has their flaws, and TK's no exception. Though to be honest, it felt kinda like the writers weren't sure what they wanted to do with TK, and as a result, a lot of his flaws seem a little contradictory to the rest of his character, but I'll get to that. At the start of Season 2, TK has more experience than any of the other active Digidestined. He's been a part of the team since the very beginning, even longer than Kari, who didn't join them until the original adventure was already more than half over. On top of that, the argument could be made that his partner is the most powerful of all. Unlike Gatomon, Patamon is usually the last to reach the next evolution level, and these big reveals tend to be reserved for when things look bleakest. When the powerhouses of the group couldn't get the job done, Angemon rushed to the rescue. With his poorly explained, a little too convenient set of powers. Oh well, the point is, the deck was most certainly stacked in TK's favor. But even without all that, TK was just naturally a better leader. He didn't rush into decisions, and here's where the contradictions pop up. He didn't lose his temper easily. The thing about 02 is that the writers didn't always seem to know what they wanted to do with their story and characters. Early on, it looked like they were trying to replicate the old cast dynamics with the new ones. This was especially clear with the crests. Each of the new characters was set up to be a blend of two of the older ones. Davis got the crests of courage and friendship, meaning he was supposed to be a blend of Matt and Tai. Except he didn't really have either of their reasoning skills, and it's a little hard to have a rivalry with yourself. Not impossible, but Davis is definitely not deep enough to pull off that sort of inner conflict. Anyway, TK was the most logical person to fill this spot. At a glance, anyway. There had already been some tension when Davis was getting possessive over Kari. Except you don't have to look very deep into either of their characters to see why this wouldn't work. TK doesn't have his brother's arrogance or insecurity. The need to prove himself is practically non-existent, and he's seen firsthand what a relationship like Tai and Matt's can do to a team. He's clear-headed enough to know not to make waves unless there's something really serious at stake. Keep the team running as smoothly as possible. As for why a rivalry doesn't make sense for Davis, it's very simple. He doesn't hold grudges. Even the few times TK and Davis do get into it, they're usually working in perfect harmony by the end of the episode. Now, if there's one thing TK and his brother do share, it's a sensitivity to darkness. Not to be influenced and taken over by it like Matt was, but if there's one thing that gets TK's blood boiling, it's seeing something innocent or defenseless being taken advantage of. Certainly not a bad trait, but these are the only times we see TK acting a bit rash. And I don't feel like these instances are necessarily out of character. The writers attribute it to watching Patamon die during their fight with Devimon in Adventure, which can work, even if he seemed wholly unaffected by it in his childhood. But honestly, in my experience, that's just another part of growing up too, unfortunately. You develop a much more pressing awareness of risk and danger, and now TK's the experienced one. He now has to be the one doing the protecting as opposed to being the one all the other kids look out for. So I don't think TK's drastic change at seeing Devimon again is too out of character, though his coldness later on in the series always felt a little forced. This was the point where my early analysis ended, and based on the generic criteria for what makes a good leader, TK is the better choice. But that wasn't the question. The point of this analysis was to determine who was the best leader for this specific team in these particular circumstances, and when it comes to this, Davis does have an advantage over TK. The digital world is a place of children's dreams and wishes. We're shown on a few occasions that it's possible to make something happen by willing it to strongly enough, with mixed results. The times when this has worked out well has led me to believe that to truly access this world's power, you need a lot of blind faith, believing everything will work out well even when you have no reason to. What would make TK a good leader elsewhere would actually be a downfall for him here. He thinks too much and is likely to get deterred by possible consequences. On the other hand, not thinking is one of Davis's strengths. Davis's overly trusting nature is just part of who he is, but it first starts to really show itself once Ken stops being the Digimon Emperor. Davis is the only one who trusts and forgives Ken immediately. It's mostly thanks to Davis that Ken ever becomes part of their team at all, and imagine where they would have been without him. Of course, Davis's strengths in this area really shines through in their final battle when he's the only one not affected by Malomyotismon's tricks at all and manages to bend the world to his will. It's worth noting that TK and Kari were both pretty indecisive about what to do with Ken, and they both had to be broken out of the dream state at the end. So I never thought I would say this, but Davis has earned his place as leader for the 0-2 team. I maintain that TK's the better leader in general, but for a land that doesn't really run on logic, when the secret to success is the very essence of cheesy children's cartoons, well, in that case, Davis can manage just fine. And that is my conclusion. Davis is a suitable leader for this particular set of circumstances. But almost any other character would have done a better job when it comes to leadership in general. Thank you for watching.